action.
Okay, right. Good evening, everyone. I've done the introduction. One thing that we always say to people is that unlike some, we always don't mind people interrupting and asking questions as we go along. If it's something very quick, I'll answer it straight away. If it's something that I know is going to be cropping up later on in the talk, again I will just say, yeah, I will get into that in a short while. If it's something a little bit more complicated, or it's going to be a slightly long-winded answer, then I tend to say leave it to the halfway break or to the end. So,
would you mind just closing the door?
Oh, thanks. Let me.
Oh, right. Thanks.
No problem. That was a quick question. Okay, so tonight we'll be talking about cholera in Bedford. It is actually 170 years since the last major outbreak of cholera. It was in the autumn of 1849. And what I'm going to do, the first half of the talk, I'm going to be talking about a little bit about cholera in general and how cholera spread around the world and ended up in Bedford as one of the places. It went all over the place, but it certainly ended up in Bedford at one point. And then in the second half, I should be talking about cholera in Bedford and its effects on the population of Bedford. And also, at the end, the last section, is going to be on what Bedford did to help prevent cholera coming back again. Because 1849 cholera outbreak in Bedford was, in fact, the very last time it visited Bedford. It was still London had outbreaks of cholera into the 1860s, and other places in Bedfordshire had outbreaks of cholera later on in the 1850s. But by the time we got to the second half of November 1849, that was the last time anyone died of cholera in Bedford, almost exactly 170 years ago. Now, there was an awful lot of adverts going around. There was one on that front page, which is also on the posters and flyers for this talk, was one that was set up in Bedford. It was actually published the day after the first case of cholera. And but there were so many printers already had stuff that must have been already set, because it was all. There was loads of posters available, and they're all fairly similar, and it tend to be things like this. It tells you what you ought to be doing: be temperate in eating and drinking, abstain from cold water, sleep and clothe warm. This one over here is slightly more interesting. It's smaller print, so it's not so easy to read. This actually comes from Aberystwyth in August 1849. And some of it's useful advice, some of it isn't. It does say things like what sort of food to avoid, and for some reason it mentions plums. Fresh fruit, especially plums. Now I'm not quite sure why plums were singled out as something. But again, there was all talk about making sure that the water was clean. And avoiding spirits. Spirits were always considered something that was a bit of a risky thing to drink. But what we really need to sort of think is that 200 years ago, sanitation was generally pretty poor. People didn't have running water. You couldn't go to a tap and just turn water on and get safe water. If you went to the toilet, it didn't flush away, never to be seen again, or hopefully never to be seen again. It went into a cesspit or something like that, and it stopped quite close to where you lived. Sometimes it actually stopped where you lived, because a lot of the cesspits were actually built either under houses or in cellars, which is obviously not particularly appetising.
So they didn't actually have the sewers?
There weren't sewers as such. There was often natural streams or sort of channels that had been dug, but most of them were open. Sometimes they were covered over, but there wasn't anything in the way of what we would call sewers these days. One thing I do have to say, there's a couple of, there aren't very many photographs in it. Most of my talks have vast amounts of photographs. There aren't very many in this, simply because photography was in its infancy and there wasn't anyone around to photograph anything. But there are going to be a lot of engravings and drawings and watercolours and things like that. Some of them are of sort of people who are suffering through cholera. They're not particularly gruesome, but they're not sometimes the nicest things to look at. And the other thing is that because basically cholera is an extreme form of diarrhoea, I will be talking quite a lot about excrement, faeces, etc. So what I was actually thinking was, if you go away and someone says, what was the talk all about? And you say, oh, it was an overall crap. I won't be upset, because that does actually describe some of the bits I'll be talking about. So, what is cholera? Oh, look, you were talking about sewers. One of the things, this main bit here comes from the Bedford Improvement Act 1803, which was an act of Parliament that was pushed through to make sure that all sorts of things, as far as sanitation and various other things were concerned in the town of Bedford. One of the main things was the fact that they wanted to knock down the old stone bridge and replace it with the bridge that's there now. But there's lots of things about what you could and couldn't do in the streets. Now, these people here were members of a night soil gang. Now, to work on the night soil gang is not the most pleasant of things. Basically, they collected excrement overnight. And in the Bedford Improvement Plan, it actually says, shall be further enacted that no person shall begin to empty any bog house, privy or necessary house, or take away any night soil, or bring or place any cart or carts, or removing the same from any house, place or building, within streets, lanes, etc., etc. And it had to be, they couldn't do it before the hour of 11 of the clock at night, or shall continue to take away the same after the hour of 6. So they came at night, collected everything, they emptied cesspits out. They were generally worked in gangs of 3 or 4, and they had, certainly when there was a gang of 4, they had one person who was called the Hole Man. He was the bloke who actually went into the hole that was a cesspit with a large pail. There was a rope man who pulled out the pail that was full of the stuff that the bloke had scooped out. And then there was 2 other men, these 2, who would carry the pail to their cart. This is quite a posh cart. Some of them were just an open cart. This one's actually got places especially for the pails, and got bits on the end which were tanks for putting urine in that they also collected. And it actually made quite a living out of it, because they normally had to take it outside the town, or outside the town or borough boundary, and usually it was dumped in a field, but then it was sold as fertiliser, the solid waste, and liquid waste was sold to the tanning and dyeing industry that was used in all sorts of things. So not a very nice thing, but it was a regular job. As long as everyone kept regular. But cholera swept across Europe on a number of occasions during the first half of the 19th century. And lots of the, this is a French example, where we've got death scything down large amounts of people. And again, this one, it's actually a foreign, it's a European one. Again, death carrying a banner with cholera written on it, and graves and stuff in the back, in the background. Now, because of the fact that sanitary conditions really weren't that high, no matter where you lived in a a rural area and particularly in towns where there was overcrowding. One of the problems is that amongst the sanitation was poor. There weren't the sort of things that you had these days. There was no refrigeration as such. If you were very, very fortunate and well off enough, you might have an ice house, which was usually either underground or below something, so it kept cool, and you would break or collect ice off of ponds and rivers during the winter and put it and hope they actually lasted throughout the year, insulated by the earth underneath, by being underneath. But even so, that wasn't used for run-of-the-mill stuff. It was normally used for showing off, basically. You wouldn't have put your bits of Tesco's chicken drumsticks in there. There'd be something special that they would put in the ice house or use the ice for. There were other things that you could use to help preserve food. Traditional things like pickling or using salt or fermenting. In many cases, fermenting stuff to make beer, for instance, it was actually safer to drink beer than it was to drink the water. And they used to make what's called small ale, which is relatively low alcohol beer, which children would drink as well. And they used to make family beers, again, which were sort of, apart from very young, real sort of infants, from the age of about 4 or 5 upwards, it was often safer to give your kids a bottle of beer or some beer. In fact, one of the things, when I was doing some of the research for this, I was reading through a book on that was a survey that was published in 1850, and they observed that Herefordshire was one of the few counties of England that I don't think actually had a single cholera victim in the previous 2 years, in the 1848-49. And they actually put that down to the consumption of cider in the area. With me being, I'm a cider drinker, so I thought that sounds fine.
Yeah.
But because of all these things, food didn't keep that well, sanitation was poor, diarrhea and stomach upsets were just a thing that you had to get on with. Anyone would expect at some point, every now and then, they would have an upset stomach or diarrhea. But there were 3 categories of the same sort of bowel disorders that people really feared. One was the enteric fevers, of which the most common one is typhoid. And again, it was not only caused diarrhea and sickness, but also affected the rest of the body, and it gave you a very high temperature and was deadly in a lot of cases. And that it didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, because people like Prince Albert, consort of Queen Victoria, he died of typhoid fever in 1861. And on the war memorial outside the Swan Hotel for the victims of the Boer War, there was actually more people died in South Africa during that conflict from enteric fevers than they did actually in combat. The next one that was also feared was dysentery. And again, dysentery wasn't quite so common, but it was very common amongst often amongst armies. People are on the move all the time, large bodies of people, and there was no sanitary arrangements, or very little sanitary arrangements. And that was just characterised by severe diarrhoea, but the thing that caused it caused damage to the line of the bowel, so there was often blood in the diarrhoea, and that was one of the characteristics of dysentery. But the most feared one was cholera, simply because it could be so deadly. It was not unknown for someone to go to bed one night, wake up in the night with a bit of a rumbly stomach and a bit of the runs, and be dead by nightfall the same day. And in children, it could be even faster. Children and babies were known to succumb to cholera in a matter of hours. And the reason why cholera was so deadly is the fact that it caused such extreme diarrhoea. And the reason why it caused such extreme diarrhoea is the fact that the bacteria that caused it, they didn't know it was a bacteria at the time, produces a particular toxin which attaches itself to the inside of the bowel and makes the body pump fluid from inside the body into the bowel, so it produces a very profuse watery diarrhoea, massive, 5 to 10 litres a day, which is I should just go on to the next slide, and this is what the cholera bacteria looks like. It was often described as being like a comma. It's a slight squiggle. Lots of bacteria are either round or rod-shaped, but this one is just got a slight bend on it, and it's got a bit of a tail. Each one's got a bit of a tail, and that allows it to propel itself quite freely in water. And that's one of the ways that it sort of progresses from one person or one place to another. It's actually been discovered in samples taken by an Italian doctor, but in 1854. But it wasn't recognised as such for about another 20 years, because the theory about cholera was it was always normally found in the most smelliest of places. And the theory was, there's a thing called miasma, which was the smelly air, and they thought it was to do with something in the air. They weren't looking for anything in the water, not until the 1850s, 1860s. And as I say, it produces this toxic protein, and that sets off this chain reaction in the bowel, and the body pumps fluid out from inside the bowel, and people just dehydrate extremely rapidly. Some strains, or some versions of cholera, don't produce that much toxin, so you just get fairly mild symptoms, but the nastiest ones produce more of this toxin, and it produces very, very large amounts of diarrhoea. And this is the cholera bacteria, produces this toxin, it sets off this chain reaction. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but the end result is water and sodium chloride, salt, gets pumped out, and I say huge amounts of it. In fact, it's normally called rice water stools, because it's actually almost clear. It's like the sort. It actually looks like the water that rice has been boiled up in, and as I say, 5 to 10 litres, 1 or 2 gallons of it per day.
Are there any countries where it's prevalent to this?
It's still around today. It tends to be these days in places where, for some reason, sanitation is being disrupted. There was a big outbreak. There was an earthquake in Haiti about 10 or 12 years ago. And earthquakes are very prone to causing that type of thing, even in reasonably civilised countries, because all sewage pipes and water pipes get broken by the shuddering of the earth, and it then allows sewage to mix with drinking water. The other thing that generally there's a big ongoing thing in the Yemen at the moment, in places that are in areas of conflict or war, where just basically the systems all break down, and you can't things start happening that nobody can control what's going on. There's often the thing that they fear with people going to camps, refugee camps and things, where there's someone set something up in the middle of the desert which has only got no real sanitation or not enough resources to cope with the amount of people who are actually in there. Well, anyway, this is the results of untreated cholera. Basically, you dry out. You get sunken eyes. You get wrinkled skin. the circulation starts breaking down, so particularly on the extremities, the nose, eyelids, the ears, the hands, the feet, sometimes the whole of the head, the blood supply decreases and you get a blue appearance or purpley appearance. And also it shuts down all the vital organs as well inside, and that's what usually causes the death quite quickly. One other thing it does is that it causes very bad cramps, particularly in larger muscles like leg muscles, and that's simply because you're dehydrating and all the water and salts are coming out of the body and not being replaced. And this is what's called the blue stage of spasmodic cholera. And again, it's just slightly coloured. There's blue feet, blue hands, blue face. And quite often the legs are bent because the muscles in the legs are in spasm. And this is, it says a sketch of a girl who died of cholera in Sunderland, November 1831. So what was the treatments? Well, the treatments at the time weren't that good. They all tended to consist of something similar to the old-fashioned kaolin and morphine. They generally had some sort of morphine type thing, because morphine, as well as being a painkiller, also has a slight paralysing effect on the bowels, so it stops the muscles contracting in the bowels so it doesn't push everything out so quick. And something like kaolin or chalk helps to try and, hopefully helps to try and bulk everything up. But in fact, in many ways, it's actually worse than useless, because the diarrhea that's caused by cholera actually gets rid of everything, including the cholera itself. Provided you don't dehydrate, you're going to feel weak, but you'll survive. If you take something like this is the original old Dr. Collis Brown's one from the 1830s, which was basically a morphine mixture. If you keep it in longer, it can do more damage. So it's not really the best thing. So, and this one's quite interesting though. It's a simple remedy. It actually says take a tablespoonful of brandy, as much powdered rhubarb that will lie on a shilling, make a strong tea of chamomile flowers, mallows and mint, and take a teacupful frequently. Again, it will get some fluid in, so it might do something, but I can't imagine that doing much. But the second remedy is even worse. Get 2 pieces of wood, each 6 inches square and 1 inch thick. Place one of them against the bars of a fire grate or in a heated oven until quite hot. Wrap it in a flannel and lay it on the bowels. It will might have a slight soothing effect on any sort of aches and pains, but it's not going to do anything for the actual cholera itself. It does actually say if you can't get 2 pieces of wood, it says you can use 2 pieces of tile. So if you haven't got any wood, take a tile off the wall or off the roof or whatever. But the real way of actually combating cholera, antibiotics work to a certain extent. They will actually kill off the bacteria, but they go straight through you just as fast as anything else does, so they're not actually in place long enough to do very much. But what you actually do, the way of treating it is just to make sure that you replace all the fluids that you lost. And this is actually a fairly modern hospital, cholera ward in, I believe it's in the Middle East. And it's quite crude, but it's actually very effective. You have special cholera beds. You'll notice that each of them got a hole in it. They used to be made of canvas, but they're now normally made of plastic or rubber. You basically lie the cholera patient on it, undressed, stick their bum in the hole, put a bucket underneath. There's the buckets underneath. And the buckets they always recommend to be marked with how much liquid is in there. And you just replace whatever is being lost. If you've lost a litre of liquid, you make sure they actually have a litre of liquid. It does cause, because cholera causes nausea and vomiting as well, sometimes you can't keep the liquids down, and the only way that you can actually treat them is by using an intravenous drip. But it's actually relatively quick and simple. There's the sort of things that you have these rehydration sachets, and if you haven't got that, if you're in a country that's not rich enough to have pre-made sachets, I know the World Health Organization had a double-ended spoon which tells you how much sugar. It's a picture of sugar, salt and boiled water, and it actually tells you one end of the spoon for the sugar, the other end for the salt. You mix it up with a certain amount of water that's been boiled up, and then just give it as freely as possible. The more you can drink, and certainly enough to replace whatever's ended up in the bucket. Oh, that's sugar. Now, we go back to 1815. Now, 1815 should have been a good year because in June there was the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's army had been defeated, and peace for first time for several decades. Most of Europe was at peace. But something happened the other side of the world that was pretty catastrophic, the other side of the world, and also affected this end of the world as well. And it was an enormous volcanic explosion. It was the biggest volcanic explosion in recorded history. Like earthquakes, when they have the Richter scale, there's a scale for volcanic explosions as well. And like the Richter scale, to go from, say, a 6 to a 7, you're not going up 1. A 7 is 10 times more powerful than a 6. A 6 is 10 times more powerful, again, than a 5. And this volcanic explosion was a 7, which is about the highest it goes. Certainly hasn't been an 8 recorded in the last 250,000 years. And this happened on an island in Indonesia called Mount Tambora. It erupted for about 3 months, started in April 1815, and this 14,000-foot mountain lost about half its height in those 3 months. There was over 70,000 people killed locally, but there was so much ash and noxious gases and sulphur and stuff like that ending up in the atmosphere. It actually had an effect on the climate for the next few years. In Europe, the next year, 1816, in Europe and in North America, it was known as the year without summer because it never really warmed up over the summer. It was cold, it was wet, it was overcast, and it led to crop failure over all of Europe and a lot of the eastern coast of North America. And this led to food riots. There was all sorts of strange things. They had brown snow in Hungary being reported, and that was in June. But this, because by this time a lot of people were taking measurements of temperature and things like that, and they've actually been able to produce a map of Europe showing the temperature. This is called the temperature anomaly for the summer of 1816, and anything that was bluish means it was colder than normal, and some areas were 3 to 5 degrees colder than normal. Most of France and a lot of the south of England. Of course, if this happened thousands of miles away in Europe, you can imagine what happened closer to home in Southeast Asia. And there was monsoon season. There was far worse than normal, and there was an awful lot of flooding. There was crop failure, so that which led to famine as well, and that meant that everything was prone to. It was just almost like a perfect storm of things could happen, that cholera could break out, and cholera was rife in that area anyway. We did have a few cultural things, certainly in Europe. the poets Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, along with his wife-to-be Mary, they were stopping in a villa on the south side of Lake Geneva that summer, and they were hoping to sort of get inspiration for works by walking in the Alps and seeing the spectacular scenery. But it was appalling weather. They were stuck indoors for most of the summer, and they actually resorted to writing horror stories to keep themselves amused, of which Mary Shelley published anonymously Frankenstein 2 years later. One of the other guests who was stopping with them, who was actually Lord Byron's personal physician, he wrote a story called The Vampire, which was an inspiration for vampire and Dracula movies, Dracula stories later on. And this is a first edition of Frankenstein from 1818. And even once the weather had started to improve again, the cold was less severe, the ash and gases in the atmosphere caused the sun to be dimmer than normal, and it gave a strange yellow appearance, and it was particularly true at sunrise and sunset, and we got very spectacular effects. A lot of famous artists got their paintings at the time of landscapes, etc., feature this very strange yellowy orange hue to the sky. This one was, these are all both by Turner, one at Petworth and Chichester Canal, and you see it's a very strange light. The boat on the canal is actually a collier, and I'll be talking about colliers later on. And Turner actually died of cholera a few years later in an epidemic in 1851. And this was one that Turner did of Bedford. It was one of a series of river scenes that was published in a book. This was done in 1828, but it was published in a book of British river scenes. And this is Bedford on the Ouse, and it was published in a book in 1831. Again, 1831 is a significant year. So you've got the Town Bridge, the Swan Hotel. This is Castle Mound, a bit exaggerated, but Castle Mound and St Paul's. And one of the boats here, one of the larger boats, almost certainly is full of coal. And again, we'll be talking about that fairly shortly. So, the weather was appalling in that area of India, and devastated by floods and famine, cholera broke out and it spread across into China, Southeast Asia, followed trade routes to the Middle East and also to ports on the Indian Ocean. But it all died down fairly quickly. By 1823, it died down. However, 1826, another massive outbreak from the same place. This time it spread into Europe. It reached Russia. There was 250,000 cases in Russia and about 100,000 deaths in 1831. It spread along the Baltic coast, ports on the Baltic, and by late summer, August, September of 1831, it reached Hamburg. And by this point, the British were getting worried because that was only a couple of days sailing to across the North Sea to ports on the east coast on the North Sea coast. They put quarantine measures in place, but the first cases started appearing in Sunderland in October 1831. It spread from all over Europe, and it spread across to North America as well in 1832. And this is an engraving of one of the early victims in Sunderland, an appearance after death of a victim to Indian cholera. And I say, the first case in this country was in October 1831, soon went to Newcastle and places on the Tyne, then reached Edinburgh, and this dotted line was the route that the colliers took coal from the Durham coalfields down the coast. Reached London, and London was badly affected for most of 1832. But also, it came down the River Ouse. Coal was dropped off, usually at either King's Lynn or Wisbech, and put onto smaller boats and transported upstream to towns like Bedford. By April 1832, it reached, it struck in Ely. By May, it reached St Ives, and St Ives was an important place because that was the point where they took off the coal off of the boats that came from King's Lynn or Wisbech and put it onto even smaller boats to come up to Bedford. And we're going to have a half-time break here at this point, and let's say the second half is all going to be about Bedford. We're going to do the raffle, but also, if you haven't already had some, there's free cake at the back because it's our 60th tour.
That's next stuff.
Okay, so I'm about to start the second half.
Don't worry. You said it's fine, yeah.
That's fine, okay. So, where we left off, Cholera had reached St Ives. Not that far away. But something else had happened in 1832. It was decided, well, they wanted Bedford to have a gasworks. First gasworks in the country was in London about 20 odd years earlier. But a number of prominent townspeople, businessmen and people from the council had a meeting to decide whether or not to build a gasworks and fund it to provide. In those days, it was really just for illuminating purposes. May 1832, just before the cholera reached St Ives, they decided that yes, a gasworks should be built in the town, and it actually went pretty quickly. Gasworks was built, and they were hoping to get it ready and up and running by the end of the year. In the end, it didn't quite work according to plan. But one of the problems with the coal supplies was that coal could only be transported up the river at certain times of the year. It couldn't be transported when the river was low during the summer, and it also couldn't really be transported when the river was flowing too fast in more wet and wintry weather. So knowing that they were going to need coal to make the coal gas, extra supplies of coal were ordered and transported up the river to Bedford in the sort of early summer of 1832. And with the coal came cholera. Various places on the route from St Ives to Bedford were affected, and there was one report I saw they couldn't quite work out why Reynolds had a number of cases of cholera, but Goldington, which was lower lying and slightly more swampier area, which fitted in with their theory that it was swampy, damp area with the swampy and also sort of smelly areas. Goldington was spared, but Bedford was actually hit quite hard. There was about 30 deaths over the course of from July through to September, October, November time. One of the there weren't any local newspapers at the time, so the reports aren't available for anything telling you what had actually happened. There were various reports done afterwards saying what the effects were, but they, compared with you'll see when I talk about the 1849 outbreak, there were quite detailed reports in local newspapers in that one. And the ordinary person didn't get a mention. It only tended to get a mention if someone who was fairly well known in the area had been affected by it. And one of the reports was Mr. Charles Palmer of Rowney Farm, which is near Salville. He felt indisposed whilst breakfasting with his friend T. Short, Esquire, surgeon of Bedford, on Sunday last, and died by 2 o'clock the same day of cholera. So it was so one of these things that was could be very, very rapid. Where he actually got it from, he could have got it in, he may have got it in one of the villages, or he may have just got it when he was visiting Bedford to visit his friend the surgeon. And the next slide actually tells you is a more detailed one on one of the more well-known people in Bedford. These newspaper reports come from the Huntingdon, Bedford and Peterborough Gazette. That one's September. This one's October, towards the end of October, and they're actually saying we're happy to learn that cholera has fast disappeared from this town. Brandy has been plentifully distributed to the poor where it was deemed necessary under medical advice. So, brandy was was a remedy. The other interesting bit at the bottom, so this is at the end of October, it was saying that St Paul's Church is about to be lighted with gas, and it's been suggested that the dial of the clock be illuminated. In the end, they were a little bit ahead of themselves because the gas wasn't actually put on stream until about the 14th of January, in 1833. But at that point, they had 7 miles worth of. It actually said there were 7 miles of gas pipes by then, so it's already quite a good gas network. But it was only really used for illumination. They didn't use it for cooking or anything like that in those days when we first had it. But as I said, there was if something happened to someone more prominent in the community, Joseph Thackeray, who was the main physician at Bedford Infirmary, he'd been there nearly 20 years, and he'd actually campaigned and organised all sorts of funds to enlarge the infirmary, and he actually opened a medical library and donated a large quantity of medical books from his own collection to start a library at the infirmary. And this painting is apparently, well, all the things I've seen, I've never seen it, but apparently it is actually hung in Bedford South Wing Hospital, or certainly was at some point, of Joseph Thackeray. This report from the day, another thing I've noticed, that you have to be quite careful with some of these old reports, because quite a few things said that he died on the 13th of July, but in fact that was the date he was buried. Because this is a report from the Bucks Gazette in Buckingham on the 14th saying that he died on the 5th, but he was interred yesterday on the Friday. This was published on the Saturday. It was a very big funeral. It was at St Peter's Church. It was attended by every mark of respect. Tradesmen in the high street spontaneously closed their shops and every bell in the town tolled. And he was carried by, amongst other, the Captain Polhill, who was the MP at the time, and the Whitbread, W.H. Whitbread, who was the chairman of the Board of Governors, the president of the Board of Governors of the Bedford Infirmary. He was there as well. So it was a very big thing. So, but the ordinary person didn't get a look in. If there was roughly about 30 deaths in the town, but there's only really 2 that are found that actually mention anyone in particular. after 1832, after it all died down in 1832, there weren't any more outbreaks. There was a minor outbreak in 1842, and there was 4 deaths in Bedford in 1842. But the next major outbreak came in the autumn of 1849, and this is what I'll mainly be talking about. Lots of the country had been affected from the previous year, and it was raging through many large towns and cities around the country all through the previous year, and it was particularly sort of late spring and the summer months of 1849. So in fact it started to die down a little bit in some places by the time it arrived in Bedford. One thing is that railways had arrived by now. The railways through Bedford, the main lines, didn't go through Bedford itself. They just skirted what is now the East Coast Main Line and the West Coast Main Line, just sort of scraped the county, either going through Biggleswade and Sandy or through Leighton Buzzard. But Bedford had been connected to the line into Euston since 1846. And I've just done a little sort of timeline of what happened. First of all, there's a map. This was published in 1850. Bedford this is the whole country, of England and Wales, and this is an enlargement, and Bedford is just there. It's anything that's sort of slightly shaded, the darker it is, the more cases there were. And Bedford wasn't actually that bad. Some places escaped it completely. Lots of ports were affected. It's Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft, but Norwich, there was no cases in Norwich. London and the Thames Valley were affected all the way up to Oxford. Places like Thanet were badly affected. Hitchin was actually badly affected as well, this area here, and Biggleswade and Royston, also this sort of blob here. And so was the Solent. On a larger scale, there was a major outbreak. This big blob here was based on Salisbury and Bristol, South Wales. Lots of places, and almost always it was spread by through traffic on waterways, either by sea or on canals or rivers. Although it was increasingly there were sort of it was being spread by rail travel. And the 1849 outbreak, it's actually known where most of the victims lived. And there was 3 main areas: Beecham Row and the top end of Priory Street. There was about a dozen deaths from cholera in a matter of a couple of weeks in that area. White Horse Yard, which is on the site of where Marks and Spencer's used to be, and Harper Street, there was a number of deaths in that area, but there were the very first case of cholera in 1849, and the most number of deaths were on Gravel Lane, which led from what's now Midland Road to Horn Lane, and some of the areas just off of it. Tower Court was a group of slum dwellings really, just off of Gravel Lane, and Water Lane is what we now call River Street. 2 other important things I've marked in yellow is the location of where the original gasworks was, which is roughly where QD's, the car park is behind QD, and Batsis Ford, where a lot of the sewage outlets came out, and there's also where a lot of the coal wharfs were, where coal was stored once it had come down the river. And there's these, I'm going to be talking about this later, there's a couple of little islands here, some of which were made of almost pure excrement, with the stuff that came out the sewers. But I've got a slide just for that. So, a little bit of a timeline. 1849, mid-September. The second week in September, there was horse racing in Bedford, at Bedford horse racing track. You know where that was?
Where was that?
Anyone know where it was? Yeah,
Hampton,
it's where Interchange Retail Park is. It had its own. It had a little station by Cow Bridge, but the building's still there, so it had its own little halt, which would, and they sometimes used had a temporary larger sort of temporary station there for things like the races. But the races were, but they had lots of things on in town as well, so people wouldn't necessarily just go to Kempston and get off there and go to the races and leave. There was lots of balls and various things on in Bedford Town Centre. It may or may not be connected, but it certainly brought people in, and a lot of people came up there, had extra trains on from London. So it's possible cholera was raging in London, although in fact it was actually just on a slight decline in London. It had been raging throughout the summer. But 21st of September was the first death from cholera, and that was in Gravel Lane. And these are bits from some of the newspapers over the next month in the death column. It actually tells you, this first one on 21st of September was Mary Ann Litchfield of Gravel Lane. From the 25th of September to the 7th of October, there was 14 more deaths in Gravel Lane, plus one, and one in Water Lane. To put that in context, from January the 1st up to the 20th of September, there was only 6 burials of people who lived in Gravel Lane. In the next 2.5 weeks, there was 15. Not necessarily all of them died of cholera, but most of them were probably cholera victims. All of these is Thomas Craft of Gravel Lane of cholera. This one was of cholera. This one was of cholera. They're all Gravel Lane. All 4 were Gravel Lane on that one. This one here as the wife of this person here died of cholera. This one was cholera. This is the one in Water Lane. But it also said a family of 9 children, one of which has since died. Another one from Gravel Lane, another one from Gravel Lane as well. So Gravel Lane was definitely the centre of the outbreak. And then it died. It seemed to die down a bit. There's one paper after this had no deaths from cholera in the death column, and it actually mentioned elsewhere in the paper that there'd only been 1 new case of cholera. So maybe it just sort of died out. But then, on the 12th of October, there was the first of 3 deaths in Priory Street, and this was up the top end of Priory Street, the bottom road end of Priory Street. There's two of them are actually listed on this same one here, and one of the people died on the Monday. She was buried on the Tuesday, and then someone a nurse who had attended the funeral of this one died the day afterwards. Presumably contracted it at the funeral or so within 3 days, this one of the deaths in Priory Street had led to the death of someone in Beecham Row, and in the next couple of weeks, there were 6 more deaths in Beecham Row, and I'll be talking about each little section. But overlapping with that, there was 4 deaths from cholera in White Horse Yard and 1 in Harbour Street nearby. The very last death recorded was the 17th of November, and that was someone from Gravel Lane again. And there were still some cases, everyone after that recovered, and having left it roughly another month, the outbreak was officially over, and there was.
What was the survival rate?
It varied. It was normally about 50% in most cases, but in Bedford it seemed there was apparently about nearly 200 cases, and there was 35 to 40 deaths. So you're talking about 20% in Bedford. Most places it was around 50% survival rate. So, this was Gravel Lane. This is from about 1911. And so it led from Midland Road to Hall Lane, and now underneath TK Maxx and New Look. But this was a report in the Beds Mercury end of September, and some interesting things that they say about Gravel Lane. This is the Gravel Lane area. This bit here, many dwellings have no privies, others have closely contiguous open cesspools into which excrement and all sorts of indescribable filth lie bubbling, steaming and exhaling gases. Some houses have no supply of water, while whole streets of dwellings have no drains, or drains surcharged and jammed with filth. So that's a description of the Gravel Lane area. So it's not really too surprising that that was an area that was hit. And this is Beecham Row, which is now roughly where Beecham Court is at the top end of Greyfriars before you reach the junction with Bromham Road and Union Street. Behind these houses are the shops of what's now Bromham Road. And again, it was quite a poor area. And if I go on to some descriptions of this, the back of Beecham Row is a filthy uncovered ditch, sometimes running with fetid water, but oftener stagnant with foul black mud and such stinking accretions that is always gathering in such places. So again, not the most sanitary of areas. And this one here, again, this was a week later. There were 9 people who went down with cholera in about a week in Beecham Row, and 8 of them died. And the rest of it is talking about trying to put new drains in to try and drain the area to make it more sanitary. This is White Horse Yard, and I say this is the corner that Marks and Spencer's used to be on, and it was a pub, a very old pub, went back to Tudor times, called White Horse. And behind it, you can't see very clearly on this photograph, but there's a gateway which went in round the back. Originally it would have just been stables, but at the turn of the sort of the 1800s, they tended to try and cram as many people into various sort of courtyards, and there was up to 8 families living in this courtyard at one point. This is the inside of White Horse Yard, and this is Harbour Street outside. This is the opposite where Clinton Cards was, or is. It was described as a cramped and squalid yard, and the entrance was quite narrow. It was very stuffy, but not much air. And again, this miasma thing, there's places that didn't have much ventilation were supposed to be the ones that were worse. Yeah, if you see at the top there, that's the top of Beals on that corner. And as I say, there was an outbreak of cholera. There's 3 deaths in the yard and 1 in Harbour Street in just over a week.
So he pulled down a Tudor pub to make way for what was there.
Marks and Spencer's, yeah.
Well, that must have been taken in the 20s or 30s.
That was taken in the 20s, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Motorbike on the right.
Yes, that was taken just it was 1928, 1929 this would have been taken. So late 20s.
It was pulled down in 1929.
It pulled down in 1929, yes.
My auntie was born there.
What, in the pub or in the yard?
Her father was the landlord.
Oh, I was the landlord, right, yeah. And south of the river, all the deaths, apart from 3 in Bedford, were in St Paul's parish. The other 3 deaths in Bedford were in the parish of St Mary's. Exact location isn't known, but there was several burials that were from notorious sort of alleyways or courts. A lot of the blame was put on the fact that the King's Ditch, which runs in a circle around the south part of the town, was used as an open sewer. This again is a later picture. This is from the 1920s, 1930s. These are the backs of the houses that were in Pilcroft Street. They've all disappeared underneath Kingsway now. But the privies in the back garden often just discharged straight into the ditch. And one of the reports from 1850s about sanitary conditions in the town actually says the open water course at King's Ditch is at times very offensive, caused by drainage of various privies into the same. And St Paul's, the upper part of the sewer in Wells Street is level with the road, which is pretty well useless because it had to be for everything to drain away. Wells Street is what's now Midland Road. If it's the sewer isn't low enough, then nothing can flow downwards into it. And it says it continues to Batsford and causes large quantities of mud and filth to collect. Low water, the smell is very offensive. The High Street, the drain is very effective, and again, it's not sufficiently low to receive the branch drains into it. So basically things just sort of stop it. It doesn't drain away properly. There's a lot of recommendations, include ones to say that one of the other things was that most of the churchyards were very overcrowded. Often the actual height of the ground was very high because so many burials had been taken place. And that was one of the things was resolved that they would open a new cemetery on the outskirts of town, which they did in 1855. But one of the other things they did was this little island. This is on a map of Bedford in 1906. This is 1841. This is 1854. Now this island, this is August 1850. It's during the past week there's wars being done to promote the health of the town of Bedford, and we remember to have achieved for many years. On Monday morning, the water in the river being drawn off, large numbers of workmen were set to work in various parts to clear out the accumulations of filth that are inevitable in such a sluggish river as the Ouse. Principal work is at what's called Batson's Ford, and here there's the mouth of a sewer in front of which was an osier bed, so reeds. Between the osier bed and the land was a mass of black mud, the accumulation of years, extending 100 yards in length and 3 or 4 feet deep. It's all been taken away so that there's a clear course of water. So basically, over decades, all the stuff that had come out these sewers at Batson's Ford had ended up in the river and clogged it up and formed its own island. So basically, an island of excrement. There was a stone plaque built into the wall, one of the old walls that surrounded Charles Wells Brewery. It was certainly still there in the 1970s, but I don't know what happened to it when the brewery was knocked down in 1976 onwards. But someone had actually made this isn't the actual plaque, but someone had actually recorded what was written on it. So the public wharf was enlarged and 2 islands removed from the river in August 1850. And so this island here, certainly, and that one, were basically accumulated filth of decades. How are we doing there? 1849 was the last time cholera attacked Bedford. It was still a problem in much of the country for many years afterwards, and there were outbreaks in Luton, Leighton Buzzard, and quite a few of the smaller villages around the Woburn area as well. And a lot of the houses that started being built, certainly the ones to the north of Bromham Road, were always actually quite decent houses, and they're quite well ventilated, in case there was the miasma, and also well attached to water and sewage systems. London was still a problem. This is a scene from London. You know, got kids playing in a dung heap in the corner. A little bit about Dr. John Snow. He was born in York, but as a young doctor, he was he encountered cholera in County Durham in several mining villages in the 1830s. He moved to London and became an early expert in the use of anaesthetics, chloroform, ether, etc. And he actually administered pain relief to Queen Victoria for her last two children. And he's very interested in the patterns of disease and how some areas were affected and some weren't. And he's famous for producing a map of Soho in an outbreak in 1854. And he realised that most of the cases were clustered around one particular water pump. And he managed to get the pump handle removed so it couldn't be used. And the cholera outbreak in that area abated. And this is his famous map. The pump that was causing the problems is this one here. And all these black lines indicate how many people had suffered from cholera. There's lots of other pumps around, here, up here, there, and there's virtually no cases around them. They were all clustered around this one pump. And there's now a pub name, on that corner there's a pub called the John Snow, and on the side of the pub there's a commemorative plaque commemorating the fact that his research linked it to the water pump.
I'm sure there was a programme done by Ian Hislop about this. I seem to remember.
It's possible. There
A
have
couple
been,
of
there
years
have been,
ago.
there have been things about
And he
it.
was saying about what a real progress was made by this
Yeah.
chap. You know, his
Yes.
work.
Oh, yes, yes. So he did other stuff as well, but that's one of the things he's most famous for. There was a pump, a replica pump that's missing its handle that had been installed in the street, but it was installed up here somewhere. And last time I went down that way, it wasn't there. They were doing lots of building work down there, but it was in the wrong place anyway. It's actually on this corner here. The other thing that did that, you could actually find exactly where the pump was, because on the curbstone there was a curbstone that was a different colour. It was a pink granite instead of grey granite, and that was the actual site of the pump. It turns out that the pump, the wall of the well that the pump got the water from was defective, and there was a cesspit, an old cesspit that was crumbling as well, and it was contaminating that particular pump. But the simple thing of just taking the handle off the pump so nobody could use it, the epidemic died down. There was lots of specialist cholera hospitals set up, and quite often local dignitaries would visit it. They quite often have wealthy benefactors who paid for it. There was this is a bit of a joke one, this is a French one, saying that a lot of them, they were very fond of being said, oh, we're going to visit the cholera hospital, but they often didn't linger very long. So this is all the men in their top hats and everything, just running straight past all the cholera victims for fear that they might catch something. In London, the hot summer of 1858 became known as the Great Stink. This is a cartoon about it. The River Thames became so foul-smelling that Parliament had to be suspended. They tried putting up blankets soaked in chlorine-based things, but it didn't work. So in the end, they had to suspend Parliament. And there was such an uproar over that the sewage system that's still in use at the moment in London was installed. And this is a little cartoon about, it's called Monster Soup, commonly called Thames Water. Some fairly fantastic creatures, and a horrified woman with a sort of looking glass type thing, seeing all these strange creatures in the water. In Bedford, certain things they did straight away. They removed that island, they built a new cemetery. but the waterworks and sewerage works were a lot more expensive, and it took a lot more negotiating and various things to come to agreements on that. But by May 1865, they'd already put out a tender for proposed sewage and waterworks, and there was a number of contracts for various things, pipes, and they also needed a steam engine to operate a pump as well. So in September the 12th, 1868, there's a large article in the Beds Times about the completion of the drainage and waterworks in Bedford. And if I go on to this, what was actually constructed, and some of the bits are still there, on the road from Clapham, between the road from Clapham and the river, they built a steam pumping engine. A lot of people thought it was actually getting water from the river, but in fact it was just a very big, deep well there. The steam pump pumped the water up to the reservoir, which is, I believe, still there, at the top of what's now Mountain Heights. And because it was at a height, it's 140 feet above the average level of the town of Bedford. It meant there was enough water pressure to push just by gravity to feed water through to the town of Bedford. And these are reports again from September 1868. This is one of the earliest photographs of Bedford. This dates from 1867, and it shows the work involved in laying a new sewer. And this is the sewer work here. It led down the High Street, crossed in front of the Swan Hotel, and you'll notice that there's no embankment there, but the embankment was actually constructed to go above the sewer. So it actually meant that there was not only a nice embankment and promenade area, it also carried the sewage away from the centre of town downstream. And this is the last slide. It says, main sewer on the north side is brought to the left bank of the river and passes along the margin by the premises of the Swan Hotel. Surface is utilised in a manner which excites the admiration of strangers and forms one of the grandest improvements of modern time. Over the main is there's an embankment 25 feet wide, forming a fine promenade. The suburb known as Waterloo, which is down here where all the gardens are now. Another sewer was constructed underneath the river, taking sewage from the south side of the river. And it ended up going along the embankment and ended up on what was called the irrigation farm, which was just off of Newnham Avenue. And the irrigation farm, basically, the sewage was sprinkled onto a large area of land that they bought, and it was designed that all the waste would percolate through the soil, and it would be cleansed by travelling through layers of soil. And there was an outlet over towards Newnham, and they've actually tested it out, and they reckon that the water was actually quite pure that it came out. The water would probably take weeks or months actually to circulate through the soil and come out. And they sold, they mainly grew grasses and stuff like that, which they could then sell as fodder for animals as well. So they made a bit of money out of it as well. And that is the end of the talk. So it's basically what happened and how Bedford sorted their problems out.